They said a man born in chains could never command free men. They said a mixed-race giant from the sugar plantations of Haiti could never outrank the aristocrats of Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who would crown himself emperor of half the world, looked at him with a mixture of awe and terrifying jealousy. Because Napoleon knew the truth. He knew that in a fair fight, man to man, sword to sword, he was nothing compared to the Titan standing next to him. This is the story of the greatest soldier you have never heard of. A man who could lift a horse with his legs while sitting in the saddle. A man who single-handedly held a bridge against an entire squadron of Austrian cavalry. A man who commanded 53,000 white French soldiers while the United States was still debating whether black people counted as fully human. His enemies called him Der Schwarze Teufel, the Black Devil. His son, the famous author Alexandre Dumas, would immortalize him as the inspiration for the Count of Monte Cristo and the Three Musketeers. But history tried to erase him. Napoleon tried to bury his name in the sands of Egypt and the dungeons of Italy because he was the one man who represented everything the emperor was not. True liberty, true strength, and incorruptible honor. This is the saga of General Thomas-Alexandre Dumas, the slave who became a god of war. But before we march into the Alps and the deserts of Egypt with the general, I have a question for you. This story spans 3 continents, from the Caribbean to Europe to Africa. It is a global story of resistance. I want to know where you are watching this history unfold from, whether you are in Paris, Port-au-Prince, New York, or London. Drop your city in the comments below. Let's map out the legacy of the Black Devil together. To understand the giant, you must first understand the cage he was born into. Thomas Alexandre was born in 1762 in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which we now know as Haiti. It was the most brutal slave colony on earth, a place where sugar was harvested with blood. His mother, Marie Cécile Dumas, was an enslaved African woman. His father was a rogue French nobleman, a marquis hiding from his debts and his family. For the first 14 years of his life, Thomas was property. He was listed in the ledgers alongside the furniture and the livestock. He watched his mother toil in the heat. He learned the hard lessons of survival in a system designed to crush the spirit. But even then, there were signs. He grew fast. He was unnaturally strong. And he had a fire in his eyes that unnerved the overseers. Then a twist of fate occurred that sounds like fiction. His father, the marquis, decided to return to France to claim his inheritance. To pay for the passage, he sold his own children into slavery. He sold Thomas. It was a cold, calculated betrayal. But there was a condition. The marquis promised to buy Thomas back once he secured his fortune in Paris. Miraculously, he kept his word. At the age of 14, Thomas was purchased by his own father, freed, and brought to the heart of civilization, Paris. Imagine the culture shock. A boy who had known only the lash and the cane field was suddenly thrust into the center of the European Enlightenment. He was given a new name, a new wardrobe, and a new education. He was taught to fence by the masters of the blade. He was taught to ride by the best cavalrymen in the country. And it turned out, the boy from Haiti was a prodigy. He grew to be over 6 feet tall in an era where the average man was 5'4". His physical feats became the talk of Paris. It was said he could grasp a beam in a stable with his hands, clamp a horse between his legs, and lift himself and the animal off the ground using only his muscle. He could put 4 fingers into the barrels of 4 muskets and lift them straight out at arm's length. He was a Hercules in silk. But the idle life of a nobleman's son did not suit him. He had a warrior's spirit. When he argued with his father over his mother, whom the marquis had left behind in slavery to die, Thomas did the unthinkable. He rejected his father's title. He rejected the name of the marquis. He enlisted in the French army as a private, using his mother's name, Dumas. he entered the Queen's Dragoons, a regiment of heavy cavalry. In 1786, the army was segregated by class, if not by race. The officers were aristocrats, the soldiers were commoners. But Thomas-Alexandre Dumas didn't care. He started at the bottom. He was a sight to behold. A towering, mixed-race dragoon with a helmet of brass and a sword of steel. His fellow soldiers didn't know what to make of him initially. But when they saw him ride, when they saw him fight in the duels that were common in the barracks, the skepticism turned to hero worship. He was the strongest man in the regiment. He was the best swordsman. He was a natural leader who radiated a quiet, terrifying confidence. Then, in 1789, the world broke apart. The French Revolution exploded. The Bastille fell. The king was eventually dragged to the guillotine. The old order of aristocrats was swept away in a river of blood. For most, the revolution was a time of terror. For Thomas-Alexandre Dumas, it was a ladder. The new French Republic was at war with all of Europe. They needed soldiers. They needed leaders. And they didn't care about noble bloodlines anymore. They cared about talent. The Republic declared that all men were free and equal citizens, regardless of color. It was a radical, explosive idea. Dumas rose like a rocket. In a span of 2 years, he went from a corporal to a general. Think about that trajectory. It is unprecedented in military history. He was leading patrols in 1791. By 1793, he was a general of division, commanding 10,000 men. He was the first person of African descent to become a general in the French army, or any Western army. He was given command of the Black Legion, La Légion Noire, also known as the Legion of Americans. It was a unit comprised of free black men and mixed-race men from the colonies. A regiment of lions led by a giant. They were fierce. They were committed to the ideals of the revolution because they knew exactly what slavery looked like. But the test was coming. The monarchs of Europe, Austria, Prussia, Spain, were marching on France to crush the revolution and put the chains back on the people. General Dumas was sent to the Alps. He was about to face the Austrian Empire in the freezing, jagged peaks of the mountains. He didn't have enough shoes for his men. He didn't have enough food. But he had his sword. He had his genius. And he had an anger that could melt the snow. The Austrians looked down from their fortresses on the ice cliffs and laughed. They saw a ragtag army led by a mulatto. They thought it would be an easy fight. They were about to meet the devil. General Dumas arrived in the Alps in 1974, but he wasn't given an army in the traditional sense. He was given a mob of starving scarecrows. The army of the Alps was in a state of wretched destitution. The soldiers of the French Republic were shivering in the high-altitude passes, their uniforms in tatters, their feet wrapped in rags because the supply lines had failed to deliver boots. They were freezing, they were hungry, and they were staring up at the impregnable stone fortresses of the Austrian Empire, perched on the cliffs like eagles' nests. The Austrians were comfortable. They had warm barracks, plenty of food, and the ultimate strategic advantage, the high ground. They looked down at the French camps in the valleys and scoffed. No army could scale those peaks in the winter. It was military suicide. The terrain itself was a weapon, a wall of ice and granite that had stopped armies since the time of Hannibal. But Thomas-Alexandre Dumas looked at the cliffs and saw something else. He saw a challenge. He realized that a conventional attack was impossible. If he marched his men up the main roads, the Austrian cannons would wipe them out. So he decided to do the impossible. He decided to turn his infantry into mountaineers. He ordered the local blacksmiths to forge thousands of crampons, iron spikes that could be attached to the boots of his soldiers. He studied the maps with the intensity of a scholar. He found the goat paths, the sheer rock faces that the Austrians had left unguarded because they believed no human being could climb them. In the dead of night, amidst a howling blizzard, General Dumas led his men up the vertical face of Mont-Cenis. Imagine the scene. Thousands of men climbing in silence, their breath freezing in their beards, the metal spikes of their crampons crunching into the ice. One slip meant death in the abyss below. Dumas, with his immense strength, was at the front, hauling men up over the ledges, physically pulling his army up the mountain. When the sun rose, the Austrians looked out from their battlements and froze in horror. The French were not in the valley. They were above them. Dumas launched the attack. It was a massacre. The Austrians, panicked by the sudden appearance of this phantom army, broke and ran. Dumas captured the pass. He captured the cannons. He captured the impossible. He wrote to the Committee of Public Safety in Paris, "We have slept on the Mont-Cenis. The battery is ours." It was a masterstroke of tactical genius. It proved that Dumas was not just a brute. He was a brilliant strategist who understood terrain better than the aristocrats who had studied war in comfortable academies. But the legend of the Black Devil was truly born 3 years later, in 1897, during the campaign in Italy and the Tyrol. By this time, a new star had risen in the French sky: Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was small, intense, and possessed a hunger for power that would eventually consume the world. Dumas was his opposite: massive, gregarious, and devoted to the ideals of the Republic: liberty, equality, fraternity. They were the two most capable generals in France, and for a brief time, they fought on the same side. The French army was pushing the Austrians back across the Alps, driving toward Vienna. The fighting was vicious. In the Tyrol, near the village of Clausen, the French advance guard found itself cut off. General Dumas was riding at the front, as always. He crossed a narrow wooden bridge over the Issac River, but as he crossed, he realized that the bulk of his troops had fallen behind. He was alone on the far side of the river, and charging toward him was a squadron of Austrian cavalry, 30 horsemen, dragoons, the elite of the Austrian army. They saw a single French general, isolated on the bridge. They drew their sabers. They smelled blood. They charged, expecting to cut him down in seconds and seize the bridge to flank the French army. They didn't know who they were charging. Dumas didn't retreat. He didn't spur his horse back across the bridge to safety. He spurred his horse forward. He positioned his massive mount sideways across the narrow exit of the bridge, turning himself into a living barricade. What happened next is the stuff of Homeric epic. It is the kind of story that, if it appeared in a movie, you would say it was unrealistic. But it is documented in the military records of the time. General Dumas fought them all. He was a giant of a man, wielding a heavy cavalry saber with a speed and ferocity that terrified the Austrians. He slashed left and right. He parried the blows of 3 men at once. He lifted men out of their saddles with the sheer force of his arm. He used the body of his horse as a shield and a weapon. The Austrians were bottled up on the bridge. They couldn't surround him because the path was too narrow. They had to come at him 1 or 2 at a time, and he cut them down like wheat. He was shot at. His uniform was sliced. He was bleeding from several wounds, but he did not move. For minutes that must have felt like hours, Thomas-Alexandre Dumas held the bridge at Clausen against an entire squadron. He was Horatius at the bridge, reincarnated in the form of a black man from Haiti. When the French reinforcements finally arrived, rushing across the river, they found a scene of carnage. Austrian bodies and horses littered the ground, and standing amidst the wreckage, exhausted, bleeding, his sword notched and dull from the impact of bone and steel, was General Dumas. The Austrians fled. They told stories of the giant who could not be killed. They whispered about Der Schwarze Teufel, the Black Devil. The name stuck. It was a title earned in the currency of fear. Napoleon was ecstatic. He recognized the propaganda value of the feat. he ordered a painting commissioned. He called Dumas the Horatius Cocles of the Tyrol, referencing the legendary Roman hero who had defended a bridge against an invading army. For a moment, Dumas was the most celebrated soldier in France. He was the proof that the revolution worked. A former slave had become a savior of the nation. But in the shadow of this glory, a dangerous rot was setting in. Napoleon Bonaparte was not a man who liked to share the spotlight. He looked at Dumas, at his height, his charisma, his genuine popularity with the troops, and he felt a pang of jealousy. Napoleon was building a cult of personality. He wanted soldiers who were loyal to him, not to the Republic. Dumas was a problem. He was an idealist. He believed in the principles of 1789. He hated looting. He punished soldiers who abused civilians. He spoke his mind. He wasn't afraid of Napoleon. In staff meetings, while other generals nodded and scraped, Dumas would stand up and argue. He was taller than Napoleon, louder than Napoleon, and, in a fair fight, deadlier than Napoleon. This tension came to a head during the preparations for the next great adventure, the invasion of Egypt. Napoleon had a dream of conquering the East, of becoming a new Alexander the Great. He assembled a massive fleet and an army of 40,000 men. He asked Dumas to command the cavalry. Dumas accepted. He saw it as another war of liberation, another chance to spread the ideals of the revolution. He packed his bags. He kissed his wife, a white Frenchwoman named Marie-Louise, and his young son, Alexandre, goodbye. He didn't know that he was sailing into a trap. He didn't know that the desert would be the place where his career and his life would be dismantled by the pettiness of the man he called a friend. The Black Devil had conquered the ice. He had conquered the Austrians. But he was about to face an enemy he couldn't slash with a sword, the political ambition of a dictator. As the French fleet set sail across the Mediterranean, dodging the British Navy, the relationship between the two generals was already fraying. Dumas began to see that this wasn't a war for liberty. It was a war for Napoleon's ego. And Dumas was a man who could not keep his mouth shut when he saw injustice. The stage was set for a tragedy. The hero of the Alps was about to become the prisoner of the desert. In the next block, we will land in Egypt. We will see the culture shock of the French army, the brutality of the desert warfare, and the specific moment when General Dumas confronted Napoleon about his ambitions. A confrontation that would seal his fate and lead to one of the most unjust imprisonments in history. The Black Devil is about to meet the Little Corporal, and only one of them will walk away with a crown. In July 1798, the French army of the Orient landed in Alexandria. They stepped out of their boats and into a furnace. The soldiers were wearing heavy wool uniforms designed for the chilly fields of northern Europe. They were carrying heavy packs, and they were marching into a desert summer where the temperature often exceeded 110 degrees. The water was scarce, the wells were poisoned by retreating Bedouins, and the blinding sun caused an epidemic of ophthalmia, leaving thousands of French soldiers temporarily blind, stumbling through the dunes holding onto each other's belts. For General Thomas-Alexandre Dumas, the invasion of Egypt was a nightmare from the start. He was the commander of the cavalry, but there was a cruel joke. There were no horses. The transport ships carrying the animals had been delayed or lost. So the greatest horseman in Europe, the giant who had held the bridge at Clausen, was forced to march on foot through the sand, leading a cavalry division that looked more like a column of beggars. The physical hardship was brutal, but the psychological toll was worse. The French soldiers had been told they were going on a glorious adventure to liberate Egypt from the Mamluks and strike a blow against England. Instead, they found themselves dying of thirst, hunted by shadows, and realizing they were pawns in Napoleon's personal game of empire. Morale collapsed. The men began to grumble. Then they began to shout. Suicide became common. Soldiers would simply blow their brains out rather than take another step in the sun. In this atmosphere of near mutiny, the senior generals began to talk. They gathered in the tent of General Dumas. It was the natural place to go. Dumas was the most senior general after Napoleon. He was charismatic, he was beloved by the troops, and he was known for his honesty. In the privacy of the tent, amidst a feast of watermelons, the only source of hydration they could find, generals like Lannes and Murat vented their fury. They asked the dangerous question, why are we here? Are we here for the Republic? Or are we here to build a throne for the little corporal? Dumas, never one to bite his tongue, agreed. He saw Napoleon's ambition for what it was, a betrayal of the revolution. He believed they should finish the campaign and go home, not stay to build an Oriental empire. But in Napoleon's army, the walls had ears. The conversation in the tent was reported back to the future emperor. Napoleon was furious. He confronted Dumas. The scene is one of the great what-ifs of history. Two titans standing face to face in the desert. Napoleon, small, intense, radiating a cold intellectual power. Dumas, massive, muscular, radiating a warm, righteous anger. I have heard, Napoleon reportedly said, that some of the generals saw fit to hold a meeting in your tent, where they discussed the safety of the army and the motives of its commander. Dumas didn't deny it. He looked Napoleon in the eye. It is true, he said. The troops are demoralized. They are dying. I believe that the glory of our arms and the interests of France should come before the personal ambition of any man. It was a slap in the face. Dumas had essentially called Napoleon a traitor to his face. Napoleon threatened to have him shot for sedition. Dumas put his hand on the hilt of his sword. For a moment, it seemed the French high command would tear itself apart right there in the sand. But Napoleon was calculating. He knew he couldn't execute Dumas. The Black Devil was too popular. The soldiers loved him. If he killed Dumas, he risked a full-scale mutiny. So, they reached an uneasy truce. But the friendship was dead. Napoleon marked Dumas in his mental ledger as an enemy, a man to be destroyed, not with a bullet, but with silence. Despite the tension, Dumas continued to fight. At the Battle of the Pyramids, he commanded his horseless cavalry with a brilliance that helped shatter the Mamluk charge. He entered Cairo as a conqueror, but his heart wasn't in it. He was sick. The desert heat was destroying his constitution. He missed his wife, and he was disgusted by the looting and the imperial pretensions of Napoleon. He asked for leave to return to France. Napoleon granted it with a suspicious eagerness. He wanted his rival gone. He wanted the giant shadow of Dumas removed so he could shine alone. Go, Napoleon said, and take any other generals who want to leave with you. It was a purge disguised as permission. In March 1799, General Dumas boarded a leaky, requisitioned vessel called the Belle Maltaise. He was accompanied by a geologist, a general named Manscourt, and a hold full of wounded soldiers. They set sail for France, believing they were leaving the hell of Egypt behind. They were wrong. They were sailing into a catastrophe that would make the desert look like paradise. The Belle Maltaise was a wreck. It wasn't seaworthy. As they crossed the Mediterranean, they were hit by a violent storm. The ship began to sink. They threw the cannons overboard. They threw the cargo overboard. They were taking on water fast. They needed a port, any port, or they would drown. They limped toward the Kingdom of Naples in southern Italy. Here is the tragedy. When they had left France a year earlier, the Kingdom of Naples had been a sister republic, a French ally. Dumas believed he was sailing into friendly waters. He didn't know that while he was in the desert, the geopolitical map of Europe had been redrawn. The French had been driven out of Naples. The Sanfedisti, the Army of the Holy Faith, a brutal peasant army loyal to the King of Naples and hostile to the French Revolution, had retaken the city. The Belle Maltaise limped into the harbor of Taranto. Dumas, dressed in his full general's uniform, exhausted and sick, signaled for help. Instead of a welcome party, he was met by a lynch mob. The local authorities, realizing they had captured a high-ranking French general, and a monster at that, the sight of a black general terrified the provincial Italians, seized the ship. They threw Dumas and his companions into prison. But this wasn't just a jail, it was a dungeon. The fortress of Taranto was a damp stone tomb, and the treatment Dumas received was not that of a prisoner of war, it was that of an animal. The Holy Faith Army hated the French, but they hated Dumas with a special, racialized intensity. They saw him as a demon. For the next 2 years, Thomas-Alexandre Dumas, the hero of the Alps, the man who had lifted horses and commanded armies, was subjected to a slow-motion murder. They tried to poison him. They put ground glass in his food. When that didn't work, they starved him. He was kept in solitary confinement in a freezing cell. He was denied medical attention for a mysterious stomach ailment that was slowly eating him alive, likely arsenic poisoning. He wrote letters, hundreds of letters. He wrote to the local governor. He wrote to the French consuls. And he wrote to his old friend, the man who was now the most powerful person in Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon had returned from Egypt. He had seized power in a coup. He was now the first consul of France. He had the power to snap his fingers and demand Dumas' release. He had the power to exchange prisoners. He had the power to save the man who had fought by his side. Napoleon did nothing. He let the letters rot. He let Dumas rot. It was a cold, passive assassination. Napoleon knew that a broken, forgotten Dumas was better than a healthy, rival Dumas. In the darkness of his cell, the giant began to shrink. His muscles atrophied. His eyesight began to fail. His hair fell out. He became a skeleton. But his mind remained sharp. He obsessed over his family. He obsessed over the injustice. He realized that his race, which had been a badge of honor in the Revolutionary Army, was now the reason for his suffering. To his captors, he wasn't a general. He was a slave who had risen above his station and needed to be put back in his place. This imprisonment is the crucible of the Count of Monte Cristo. Years later, when Alexandre Dumas the Younger wrote his masterpiece about Edmond Dantes, a man wrongly imprisoned in the Château d'If, forgotten by the world, plotting his revenge, he wasn't just writing fiction, he was writing the biography of his father. The darkness of the dungeon, the despair, the sense of betrayal, it was all real. But unlike Edmond Dantes, General Dumas did not find a treasure map. He did not escape. He waited. Finally, in 1801, a truce was signed between France and Naples. As part of the treaty, prisoners were to be exchanged. General Dumas was released. But the man who hobbled out of the fortress of Taranto was not the Black Devil who had gone in. He was a broken man. He was half blind, deaf in one ear, partially paralyzed, and racked by stomach pain. He was 39 years old, but he looked 60. He made his way back to France, hoping for a pension, hoping for recognition, hoping that the republic he had bled for would take care of him. He was about to discover that the France he left no longer existed. The republic was dead. The empire was born. And in Napoleon's empire, there was no room for a black hero. When General Thomas-Alexandre Dumas stepped off the boat in France in 1801, he was expecting a homecoming. He was a hero of the Republic. He had captured the Alps. He had led the cavalry in Egypt. He had suffered 2 years of torture in an enemy dungeon for the sake of France. He believed, with the naivete of an honest man, that his country would embrace him, pay him the wages he was owed, and restore his health. He was wrong. The France he returned to was dead. The revolutionary fervor of 1789, the belief in liberté, égalité, fraternité, had been suffocated. In its place, a new empire was rising, built around the ego of one man. Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer just a general. He was the first consul, the dictator in all but name. And as Napoleon consolidated his power, he began to purge the army of the true Republicans, the men who believed in freedom more than they believed in him. Dumas was at the top of that list. The reunion with his wife, Marie-Louise, was heartbreaking. She had waited for him in the small town of Villers-Cotterêts, raising their daughter, fearing he was dead. When she saw him, she barely recognized the Titan she had married. The man who could once lift a horse was now stooped, deaf in one ear, half blind, and racked by crippling stomach pains, the lingering effects of the arsenic administered by his Italian jailers. But his spirit was still fighting. He wrote to Napoleon. He didn't ask for favors. He asked for justice. He asked for the 28,500 francs in back pay that the army owed him for the years of his imprisonment. He asked for his share of the prize money from the Egyptian campaign. He asked for a command, even a ceremonial one, that would allow him to support his family. Napoleon's response was a silence louder than a cannon blast. The emperor had a long memory. He remembered the tall, black general who had dared to question him in the desert tent. He remembered the man who was more popular with the troops than he was. He remembered the man whose very existence as a mixed-race hero challenged Napoleon's growing obsession with racial hierarchy. When aides would bring up Dumas' name, asking if the general should be granted a pension, Napoleon would fly into a cold rage. "I forbid you to speak to me of that man," he would snap. He wiped Dumas from the official histories. He refused to pay a single franc. It was a calculated, personal vendetta. Napoleon wanted Dumas to starve. But the betrayal went deeper than money. In 1802, Napoleon committed what many historians consider his greatest crime against humanity. He rolled back the clock on human rights. 10 years earlier, the French Republic had abolished slavery. It was the first European power to do so. It was a beacon of hope for the world. But Napoleon, eyeing the sugar profits of the Caribbean and dreaming of a North American empire, decided that freedom was too expensive. On May 20th, 1802, Napoleon signed a decree reinstating slavery in the French colonies. Think about the weight of that action. The French army, which had once liberated slaves, was now sent to Haiti and Guadeloupe to put the chains back on. They were sent to hunt down men and women who had been free citizens of France. But Napoleon didn't stop there. He imported the racism of the colonies back to the mainland. He issued decrees banning people of color from living in Paris. He banned mixed-race marriages, though he couldn't retroactively dissolve Dumas' marriage. He purged the army of its black and mixed-race officers. General Dumas, the hero of the Alps, was now a legal anomaly. He was a 4-star general in an army that officially didn't allow black men to serve. He was a citizen in a country that had just declared his people to be property. The psychological blow was devastating. Dumas watched as his friends, men he had commanded, men of the Black Legion, were arrested, deported, or forced into hiding. He watched the republic he loved turn into a racist tyranny. He retired to Villers-Cotterêts, living in a small, rented house. The poverty was grinding. The man who had captured millions in gold for France in the Alps now had to worry about the price of firewood. He sold his horses. He sold his weapons. But he never sold his honor. In 1802, amidst this gloom, a spark of light arrived. Marie-Louise gave birth to a son. They named him Alexandre. This boy would grow up in the shadow of a dying giant. The young Alexandre Dumas didn't know the black devil who terrified the Austrians. He knew a gentle, sad, sick man who would bounce him on his knee and tell him stories. And what stories they were. As the former general's health failed, he would sit by the fire and tell his son about the world. He told him about the crocodiles of the Nile. He told him about the snows of Mont Cenis. He told him about the bridge at Clausen, where he held off an army alone. To the little boy, these weren't military reports. They were fairy tales. His father was a mythical creature, a Hercules who had walked the earth. The boy soaked it all in. The seed was planted. The imagination that would one day give the world the Three Musketeers and the Count of Monte Cristo was being fed by the real-life adventures of a father who had lived 10 lives in 40 years. But the end was approaching fast. The poison from the Italian dungeon had done permanent damage. Dumas was in constant pain. He went blind, his stomach ulcerated. In February 1806, Thomas-Alexandre Dumas lay on his deathbed. He was 43 years old. He should have been in the prime of his life, leading the Grande Armée to victory at Austerlitz. Instead, he was dying in a rented room, ignored by the country he saved. He called for his son, but he was too weak to speak. He looked at the boy, this bright-eyed, 4-year-old child who carried his name and his blood, and he wept. He knew he was leaving him nothing. No money, no title, no protection in a world that was becoming increasingly hostile to anyone with African blood. He died on February 26, 1806. The funeral was a quiet affair. The local priest buried him. There were no representatives from the emperor. There was no military salute, no cannon fire. The man who had commanded 53,000 men was buried like a pauper. Napoleon had won. He had starved his rival. He had erased his name. He had ensured that the Black Devil would not overshadow the Little Corporal. But Napoleon made a mistake. A fatal, arrogant mistake. He forgot about the son. He didn't realize that by crushing the father, he was forging the son into a weapon of memory. He didn't know that the little boy standing by the grave, holding his mother's hand, was absorbing every injustice, every slight, every story. Marie-Louise and the young Alexandra were left destitute. Napoleon refused to grant the widow a pension. He wanted the name Dumas to disappear into the mud of Villers-Cotterêts. But poverty is a powerful motivator, and the blood of the general ran hot in the veins of the writer. The young Alexandre Dumas grew up hearing the whispers. Your father was a great man. Your father was a hero. And he saw the contrast with the official silence. He saw the statues of Napoleon's marshals rising in Paris, men who were half the soldier his father was. He swore he would make the world remember. He didn't have a sword. He didn't have an army. But he had a pen. And he was about to use it to exact a revenge that would outlast Napoleon's empire by centuries. Napoleon built an empire of borders and laws. Alexandre Dumas would build an empire of words and imagination. When General Dumas died in 1806, he left his family with 30 francs to their name. His widow, Marie-Louise, was forced to run a tobacco shop to keep them from starving. His son, the 4-year-old Alexandre, grew up in the rural backwaters of Villers-Cotterêts, uneducated, wild, and fiercely proud. The local children teased him. They mocked his mixed-race heritage. They laughed at his poverty. But whenever they pushed him too far, the boy would puff out his chest and say, "My father was a general. He commanded armies." To the villagers, it sounded like a delusion. To the boy, it was the only truth that mattered. As Alexandre grew into a man, he realized that the shadow of Napoleon still hung over his life. Even after Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo and exiled to St. Helena, the racism he had institutionalized remained. The Bourbon Restoration brought back the monarchy, but it didn't bring back the equality of the Revolution. A man of color in 1820s Paris was viewed with suspicion and disdain. But Alexandre Dumas had inherited two things from his father: his immense physical energy and his refusal to be ignored. He moved to Paris. He got a job as a clerk, and he began to write. He wrote with a speed and a fury that stunned his contemporaries. He wrote plays that caused riots in the theaters. He wrote novels that were serialized in the newspapers, with people lining up around the block to buy the next chapter. He became the most famous man in France, a literary rock star who threw lavish parties and lived life as a performance art. But beneath the surface of his adventure stories, Alexandre Dumas was doing something secret. He was building a monument. He was rewriting the ending of his father's life. If you read the Count of Monte Cristo today, you probably think it is a story about a sailor named Edmond Dantes. You are wrong. It is a biography of General Thomas-Alexandre Dumas, remixed with the fire of a son's grief. Look at the parallels. They are undeniable. Edmond Dantes is a young man of immense promise, poised to become a captain, engaged to a beautiful woman. He is betrayed by jealous rivals who envy his success. He is arrested on his wedding day. General Dumas was a man of immense promise, a commander of cavalry, married to a beautiful woman. He was betrayed by a jealous rival, Napoleon. Dantes is thrown into the Château d'If, a terrifying island prison. He is kept in a dungeon. He is starved. He is forgotten by the world. General Dumas was thrown into the fortress of Taranto. He was kept in a dungeon. He was starved. He was forgotten by France. But here is where the fiction diverges from the reality. In real life, the general was released as a broken, dying man. He came home to poverty and silence. He never got justice. The villains who destroyed him, Napoleon and his marshals, died rich and celebrated. The son could not accept that ending. It was too cruel. So, in the book, he gave his father the power of a god. In the novel, Dante does not die. He escapes. He finds a treasure of infinite wealth on the island of Monte Cristo. He transforms himself. He becomes a being of pure will, a cold, calculating avenger who hunts down the men who betrayed him one by one. He bankrupts them. He destroys their reputations. He drives them to suicide. The Count of Monte Cristo is the ultimate revenge fantasy. It is Alexandre Dumas saying to the ghost of his father, "I will give you the justice that France denied you. I will make you the most powerful man in the world, and I will make your enemies pay in blood and gold." Every time the Count destroys a villain in the book, it is the son striking a blow against the memory of Napoleon. But the general is not just in Monte Cristo. He is also the beating heart of the Three Musketeers. Critics and scholars have long noted that the Four Musketeers represent different facets of the general's personality. Athos is the general's nobility, the aristocrat who rejects his title to serve as a common soldier. Porthos is the general's body, the giant, vain, supernaturally strong man who can lift horses and craves fine clothes. D'Artagnan is the general's ambition, the young outsider from the provinces who comes to Paris with nothing but a sword and a dream to conquer the city. There is a scene in the later Musketeer books where Porthos, the giant, holds a heavy stone ceiling up with his bare shoulders to save his friends, eventually being crushed by the weight. It is a heartbreaking metaphor for General Dumas, a man who carried the weight of the Republic on his shoulders until it crushed him. By encoding his father into these characters, Alexandre Dumas pulled off one of the greatest subversive acts in literary history. He made a racist Europe fall in love with a black man. Millions of white readers in France, England, and America cheered for D'Artagnan. They wept for Porthos. They were thrilled by the Count of Monte Cristo. They didn't realize that they were cheering for a mixed-race slave from Haiti. They didn't know that the ultimate hero of European literature was a man their own societies would have put in chains. This was Alexandre's revenge. He couldn't force the government to build a statue. So he built a statue of words, and he put it in every library in the world. But Alexandre Dumas didn't just write about his father in code. He lived like him. He was proud of his heritage. When a man in a salon insulted him about his Negro blood, Dumas famously replied, "My father was a mulatto, my grandfather was a Negro, and my great-grandfather a monkey. You see, sir, my family starts where yours ends." It was a slap in the face to the entire racial hierarchy of the 19th century. However, despite the literary fame of the son, the military memory of the father continued to fade. The racism of the 19th century hardened. The scientific racism of the Victorian era tried to erase the achievements of black people. The idea that a black general had commanded white troops became inconvenient. Statues of Napoleon rose across France. His tomb in Les Invalides became a national shrine. The name Dumas became associated only with the novels, not the battles. The general became a footnote in his son's biography. And then the final physical insult occurred. In 1913, a group of admirers finally managed to erect a statue of General Thomas-Alexandre Dumas in Paris. It stood in the Place Malesherbes. It showed the general standing tall, leaning on his rifle, looking toward the horizon. It was a belated recognition, a bronze apology. But it didn't last. In 1940, the Nazis invaded France. Hitler, like Napoleon before him, knew the power of symbols. He knew that a statue of a black general in the heart of Paris was an affront to the ideology of Aryan supremacy. The Nazis tore the statue down. They melted it. They turned the bronze of the Black Devil into bullets for the Wehrmacht. It was a second assassination. First, Napoleon tried to starve him. Then, Hitler tried to erase his image. It seemed that the dictators of Europe were terrified of this man even when he was dead. For decades after World War II, the pedestal stood empty. A lonely block of stone in a Paris square. It was a gaping wound in the city, a testament to the erasure of black history. Passers-by didn't know who used to stand there. They just saw the void. But you cannot kill a legend that has been written into the DNA of culture. The books remained. The Count of Monte Cristo was read by millions. It was adapted into movies, plays, and cartoons. Every time someone read that story, the spirit of the general was resurrected. And as the 21st century dawned, a new generation began to ask questions about the empty pedestal. They began to ask about the real man behind the fiction. They began to realize that the most incredible story Alexandre Dumas ever told was the one he didn't write as fiction. We are about to enter the final phase of this saga, the resurrection. In the next block, we will see how the general is finally being honored today. We will look at the new monuments. We will look at the fight to verify his rank and his pension rights, a fight that continues symbolically. We will connect the general to the modern struggle for racial justice in France and the world. We will answer the question, why does a general from 1793 matter in 2024? The statue was destroyed. The body was buried in a forgotten grave. But the Black Devil is clawing his way back out of the earth, and this time he is here to stay. The next block is the homecoming he never got. For 60 years, there was a hole in the heart of Paris. In the Place Malesherbes, now Place du Général Catrou, 3 statues stood representing the Dumas dynasty. There was Alexandre Dumas, the writer, sitting comfortably in a chair with a book. There was Alexandre Dumas the younger, the playwright, looking dignified. And then there was an empty stone pedestal. It was a ghost monument. The bronze statue of General Dumas, the hero of the Alps, the man who had terrified the Austrians, had been melted down by the Nazis in 1940. The metal that once formed his sword and his muscles had been turned into ammunition to kill the very freedom he fought for. But after the war, when France rebuilt its cities and restored its art, they didn't replace the general. They left the pedestal empty. For decades, Parisians walked past that void without knowing who was missing. It was a perfect metaphor for the amnesia of a nation. France loves to celebrate its motto, liberté, égalité, fraternité. It loves to project itself as a colorblind republic where race does not matter. But the empty pedestal told a different story. It whispered that there was a limit to French equality. You could be a writer, yes. You could be an entertainer. But a black man with a sword? A black man with power? That was an image that post-war Europe still found uncomfortable. The general was doubly erased. First by Napoleon, who buried his military record. Then by the Nazis, who destroyed his likeness. And finally by the silence of the French Republic, which refused to cast him again in bronze. But you cannot bury a giant forever. The ground eventually shakes. In the early 2000s, the silence began to crack. A new generation of historians and writers began to blow the dust off the archives. The most significant blow against the amnesia was struck not by a soldier, but by an author named Tom Rees. His biography, The Black Count, published in 2012, was a global sensation. It won the Pulitzer Prize. For millions of readers around the world, this book was a revelation. They realized that the wildest exploits of the Count of Monte Cristo were actually toned-down versions of reality. They learned that the real Count wasn't a white sailor. He was a mixed-race general who could lift a horse. The book shamed the French establishment. It asked a simple question. Why is this man not a national hero? The pressure mounted. Activists in France, led by the group CM98, an organization dedicated to the memory of the victims of slavery, demanded that the general be honored. They demanded that the empty pedestal be filled. But how do you honor a man like Thomas-Alexandre Dumas in the 21st century? Do you just rebuild the old statue? Do you put him back on a horse? The city of Paris decided to do something different, something radical. In 2009, a new monument was unveiled. It was created by the artist Dries Sansarcidé. It is not a traditional statue of a man looking heroic. It is a massive, towering sculpture of broken slave shackles. They are huge, rusted iron cuffs, standing over 5 meters tall. One is open, the chain broken. It is called furs, irons. At first glance, it is shocking. Why reduce a general, a man who wore the uniform of the Republic, back to the imagery of slavery? Some critics hated it. They wanted to see the general in his glory, with his sword and his plumes. They argued that showing the shackles defined him by his victimhood, not his victory. But look closer. The monument is powerful precisely because it tells the whole truth. It acknowledges where he came from. It acknowledges that he was born property. But the chain is broken. It is a symbol of the strength required to shatter the system. It represents the general's life arc, from the chains of Haiti to the liberation of the Alps, and then the reimposition of chains, metaphorically and legally, by Napoleon. It stands as a reminder that his fight wasn't just against the Austrians. It was against the institution of slavery itself. It reminds Paris that their greatest general was a man who, under the laws of 1802, was considered a non-citizen. It forces the viewer to confront the racism that tried to destroy him. However, the fight for his legacy is not just about statues. It is about the Pantheon. The Pantheon in Paris is the final resting place of the great men of France. Voltaire is there, Rousseau is there, Victor Hugo is there, and in 2002, Alexandre Dumas, the writer, was moved there. It was a magnificent ceremony. The coffin of the writer was carried through the streets, flanked by actors dressed as musketeers. The president of France gave a speech about the genius of Dumas. But the general is not there. General Thomas-Alexandre Dumas is still buried in a forgotten grave in Villers-Cotterêts. The exact location is lost. His bones have likely mingled with the earth of the countryside. There is a movement, growing louder every year, to place a cenotaph, an empty tomb for the general in the Pantheon, right next to his son. It would be the ultimate reunion. The father and the son. The sword and the pen. the warrior who lived the life and the writer who immortalized it. To put General Dumas in the pantheon would be the final victory over Napoleon. Napoleon lies in Les Invalides, surrounded by the trophies of his conquests. If Dumas were to lie in the pantheon, the temple of the Republic, it would be a statement that the values of Dumas, freedom, honor, equality, are more enduring than the values of Napoleon, power, empire, and hierarchy. It would be an admission that the Black Devil was the true guardian of the French soul. But why does this matter to us, sitting here today? Why should we care about a French general from 200 years ago? Because General Dumas is the ancestor of every marginalized person who has ever had to be twice as good to get half as much. He is the patron saint of the outsider. He proved that excellence is the ultimate weapon against prejudice. When the white aristocrats sneered at him, he didn't argue. He climbed a mountain and captured a fortress. When Napoleon tried to intimidate him, he stood his ground. He teaches us that authority is not given, it is assumed. He didn't wait for permission to be a general. He took command because he was the best man in the room, and he serves as a warning. His story reminds us that progress is not a straight line. You can have a black general in 1793 and then have slavery reinstated in 1802. You can have a moment of racial enlightenment followed by a century of darkness. Rights are fragile. They can be taken away by a stroke of a pen if we are not vigilant. The general also challenges our definition of greatness. Napoleon is considered great because he conquered Europe, but he left behind a legacy of death and dictatorship. Dumas conquered the impossible, but he died poor because he refused to loot. Who is the greater man? The one who dies on a throne built on bones, or the one who dies in a rented bed with his conscience clean? The story of the Dumas family, the father, the son, and the grandson, who was also a writer, is a testament to the resilience of black brilliance. They were 3 generations of mixed-race men who dominated the culture of their times, despite the headwinds of racism. They proved that talent is genetic, but courage is a choice. As we approach the final block of this saga, we have to make a choice ourselves. Are we going to let the general fade back into the history books as a footnote? Or are we going to give him the salute he was denied in 1806? The general is still waiting. He is waiting for his back pay. He is waiting for his pension. But more than that, he is waiting for us to acknowledge that he was right. That liberty is worth dying for, and that no man is born to be a master, and no man is born to be a slave. In the final block, we will issue the ultimate call to action. We will connect the general to the modern struggle for justice. We will look at the Dumas spirit in the world today, and we will end this video not with a period, but with an exclamation point. The Black Devil is back, and he is demanding his due. The final charge is about to begin. Draw sabers. We stand now at the end of the journey. We have traveled from the cane fields of Haiti to the snows of the Alps, from the pyramids of Egypt to the dungeons of Italy. We have witnessed the rise of a superhero and the attempted murder of his memory. But as we close the book on General Thomas-Alexandre Dumas, we are left with a single, burning image that defines his existence. It is not the image of the broken man dying in poverty. It is the image of the giant on the bridge. Picture it one last time. The narrow wooden crossing at Clausen, the Austrian dragoons charging, and the lone figure of Dumas, sword in hand, holding the line. That moment is the perfect distillation of his life. He was always the man on the bridge. He was the bridge between the races. He was the bridge between the aristocracy and the common man. He was the bridge between the brutality of the old world and the idealism of the new. And just like on that day in the Tyrol, he fought alone. Napoleon Bonaparte won the battle for power. He became the emperor. He redrew the map of Europe. He died in exile, yes, but he is remembered as a colossus. His tomb in Paris is a shrine of gold and marble. But ask yourself this: what is Napoleon's legacy today? It is a legacy of hubris, of millions dead for the sake of one man's ego, of the reinstatement of slavery. General Dumas won the battle for the soul. His legacy is not written in treaties or borders. It is written in the human imagination. Every time you watch a movie about a hero who rises from nothing, who fights against corruption, who values honor above gold, you are watching the spirit of General Dumas. Through the pen of his son, he became the blueprint for the modern hero. Edmond Dantes is the avatar of his suffering. D'Artagnan is the avatar of his courage. Napoleon conquered Europe, but Dumas conquered the world's dreams. This story forces us to confront the nature of greatness. We are taught that greatness is about accumulation. Accumulating land, money, titles, power. Dumas teaches us that greatness is about expenditure. He spent his strength to save his men. He spent his health to serve the Republic. He spent his fortune to maintain his integrity. He died empty so that France could be full. And the silence? The 2 centuries of erasure? That was not an accident. That was fear. The establishment erased him because he was a dangerous proof of concept. If a black man could outfight, outthink, and outlead the white elite in 1793, then the entire lie of white supremacy collapses. To remember him was to admit that the racial hierarchy was a fraud. So they melted his statue. They hid his file. They hoped he would just be a character in a book. But the truth is a boomerang. You can throw it away, but it will come back to hit you. Today, the boomerang has returned. We are living in the era of the general's resurrection. When we see the protests for racial justice in Paris, in London, in New York, we are seeing the spirit of the Black Legion. When we demand that our leaders be held accountable to the ideals of liberty and equality, rather than personal ambition, we are echoing the argument in the desert tent. General Dumas is the patron saint of everyone who has ever been told to stay in their place. He didn't have a place. He made one. He carved it out of the ice of the Alps. So, what do we owe him? We owe him his name. We owe him the recognition that he was not just Alexandre Dumas' father. He was one of the greatest military minds of the 18th century. He was a rival to Napoleon, who might have changed the course of history if he hadn't been betrayed. We owe him the acknowledgement that the French Republic, and by extension the Western world, failed him. We accepted his service and rejected his humanity. But most of all, we owe him our courage. The general cannot fight anymore. His sword is rust. His bones are dust. But the enemies he fought, tyranny, racism, the abuse of power, are still very much alive. They have just changed uniforms. They don't wear Austrian white or French blue anymore. They wear suits. They sign laws. They stand behind podiums. When we face these enemies today, we must channel the Black Devil. We must plant our feet on the bridge. We must refuse to move. We must say, "You shall not pass." This video is not just a biography. It is a summons. It is a call to the reserves. You, the viewer, are now part of the Black Legion. You know the truth. And because you know it, you have a duty to defend it. Do not let the general die a third death. Napoleon killed him once. The Nazis killed his memory once. If we forget him now, we kill him forever. Share this story. Send it to your friends who love the Count of Monte Cristo and tell them, "Let me tell you about the real Count." Send it to your history teachers. Send it to anyone who thinks that Black history is only about slavery and civil rights marches. Tell them about the general who lifted horses. And finally, I have one last request. A final salute to the giant who died in a rented bed, but who lives in our hearts. The Austrians gave him a name out of fear. We will give it to him out of love and respect. Go to the comments section right now. I want you to type the name that rang out across the Alps. The name that proves that a black man can be the master of the battlefield. Type, the Black Devil. Let's fill the comments with thousands of salutes. Let's build a digital monument that is taller than the Eiffel Tower. Let's show the world that the general has finally returned from the dungeon. General Thomas-Alexandre Dumas, we see you, we honor you, and we are still holding the bridge. Thank you for watching. Stay strong, stay brave, and never let the bastards grind you down. Dismissed.